60 minutes.
Okay, so we are recording this, and I am getting oriented here because I've got a lot more controls down at the bottom of this than not that I'm used to seeing. But okay, welcome to Adult RE, looking at the evolving theology of Moncure Conway. I hope we can have a dialogue with this as much as
I was just trying to figure out what in the world to make for the Thanksgiving buffet, and I've always loved it when they're invited.
we.
Never sure
Hey,
about
Anne.
that. I can double it.
Hey, Anne, can we ask you to
I-
mute your computer?
I just muted her.
Oh, good. Thank you. Well, great. So I'm hoping we can have a dialogue about this because I want us to talk a little bit about theology itself, but I'm going to give some introductory work on Moncure Conway so we've got a frame of reference. And then we'll launch into a conversation about theology and this evolution from basically an Orthodox Christian theology to the theology that most Unitarian Universalists have today, which is a liberal / progressive understanding of Christianity and humanism, and also a reverence for multiple religious traditions. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit on a slideshow, and then we'll pick up conversation. And let's see here. And now we are going to share that. Can everyone see this slideshow?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to, I've got two screens so I can move things around a little bit here. But the first thing I wanted to show you was the way Conway looked when he first came to First Unitarian Church and the way Conway looked when he last came to First Unitarian Church. He arrived in Cincinnati in 1856, and he was 24 years old. His last appearance in Cincinnati, in our sanctuary, he was receiving recognition and honor from the congregation in, I think, May of 1907. And this is a photograph taken by Edward Steichen of Moncure Conway in 1907. Steichen was living in Paris, and so was Conway. And Conway at that point was seen as sort of the elder statesman of the intelligentsia of Paris at that time. So he was hanging out with pretty many well-known artists like Picasso and Edward Steichen and some sculptors. If you ever saw the movie Midnight in Paris that Woody Allen did, that's basically the world that Moncure Conway was occupying when he lived in Paris. And he died in November of 1907, fast at work on a biography of John Calvin. And that would have been, he ended up having a stroke and dying in his apartment. His wife had already preceded him in death, and so he was alone, and was found on November 15th, 1907, working at his biography of John Calvin. Let's see if I can advance the slides now. There we go. One of the famous works that Conway wrote was just a short book. It was 150 pages or so, called Christianity, which was a critique of Christianity. And I'll just read this. It says, "We found that gazing into the sky does not reveal God. Now let us try what will come of exploring the earth and man and history. The Chinese sage said to men, 'Since you do not yet know man, how can you know God? Since you do not comprehend life, how can you comprehend death?' Some of us, I, some of us believe, I believe, that eyes turned from phantom gods have caught glimpses of a divine life in the evolution of nature and the mystical movement of the heart of man." So he wrote this in 1876. And so he's 40 some years old. I think, yeah, he's actually 44 years old when he writes this. So he's exploring something pretty far afield from Christianity at this. And we'll probably come back to this quote because it reveals a lot about his deep relationship with Ralph Waldo Emerson and his understanding of where God exists in the world. And we're going to another slide here. This is a timeline. And so you can get an idea of some of the major events in Conway's life. He's born in Falmouth, Virginia in 1832, and his family is part of the Northern Virginia aristocracy. He goes to boarding school, actually the same boarding school that Robert E. Lee attended and George Washington attended previous to him. And he is a distant cousin to Robert E. Lee. His mother was from the Lee family, and his name, Moncure Conway, is actually a combination of two last names, the Moncure family and the Conway family. And so, yeah, so he had sort of an odd name to begin with. But he also was coming from this long line of Virginia aristocracy, slaveholding aristocracy. And he grew up, his family had probably enslaved close to 50 people working their farms. And he grew up with many of those people taking care of him as though they were parents, and some he played with as kids. At the age of 14, actually it's 13 or 13 and a half, he goes to Dickinson College and he graduates at the age of 17 from Dickinson. Now, I think college experience in the 19th century is a little different from college experience in the 19th century, but nonetheless, he was an absolutely brilliant young man and was pretty far advanced for his age to be able to go to college at that young age. And shortly after he leaves Dickinson College, and by the way, Dickinson College was a college that was founded by two signers of the Declaration of Independence, one a Universalist, Benjamin Rush, and the other one, I can't remember his first name, but Dickinson. And they founded Dickinson College as a Universalist college, but they were basically connected to the Methodist Church and were connected to the conservative wing of the Methodist Church. So in 1850, he decides that he's going to be a minister and he becomes a Methodist circuit rider. So bear in mind, in 1850, he's only 18 years old, and he's a circuit rider going to many congregations in Maryland and Eastern Pennsylvania. But this is significant because he runs into many of the people of many Quakers, and he also is befriended by the minister of the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, William Henry Furness. And William Henry Furness plays a major role in Conway's life from that point forward. He has great influence over him. And in fact, Furness comes to Cincinnati in 1858 when Conway is to perform Conway's marriage for him to a woman that Conway meets here in the Cincinnati church. Her name is Ellen Dana, and she becomes Ellen Dana Conway. But anyway, he has close relationships with them. And as he was riding the circuit, he would read books and let the horse take him where the horse knew to go. So he was reading Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he was also reading novels at that point. And he decides that because of the influence of Emerson on him, he writes to Emerson, and Emerson invites him to Harvard Divinity School. And so he gets to Harvard in 1853, and he spends a summer with Emerson. Emerson and Thoreau find a place for him to stay. And so he develops a very, very close father-son relationship with Ralph Waldo Emerson from that summer experience right before he enters Harvard Divinity. And he also befriends Henry David Thoreau at the same time. He graduates from Harvard Divinity School and gets involved in, whoops, I want to take this back if I can. He gets involved in abolitionist activities, and he's greatly influenced by the Unitarian minister in Boston named Theodore Parker, who was a militant abolitionist, probably more so of an abolitionist than was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Parker was an activist, and he had a major church in Boston. He also then in this time period gets introduced to Walt Whitman, and Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson had been reading Whitman's poetry, and at the request of Emerson, on his way to Washington, D.C., where he takes his first minister position, he stops in Long Island and visits with Walt Whitman, who's struggling at that point because people are not receiving his poetry very well, particularly the Leaves of Grass volume. And Conway reads it and encourages Whitman, and they develop a friendship for the rest of their lives. And in fact, Conway becomes Walt Whitman's literary agent as a result of this connection through Emerson. So he goes to Washington, D.C., and obviously 1855 to 1856, the issue of slavery is a big issue around the country, but it's an issue that is forbidden to be discussed in the Unitarian Church of Washington, D.C. And the reason being is that Washington, the Unitarian population of Washington is divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. There were many pro-slavery Unitarians, and among them was John C. Calhoun, the Southern senator from South Carolina. In fact, John C. Calhoun was one of the founders of the Washington, D.C. Unitarian Church, and he co-founded it with John Quincy Adams, who was an abolitionist and the son of John Adams, the second president. And Calhoun also served at this point as John Quincy Adams's vice president. That was how they balanced out the ticket on the issue of slavery. So this is in the 1820s, and so it's 1824 to 1828 that they are president and vice president. So by the time Conway gets to the DC church, he's warned that he has to stay away from the topic of slavery, but he finds that he can't do that. And he issues some very strident sermons on the issue of slavery. And at this point is when Charles Sumner is attacked on the floor of the House of Representatives and is severely wounded by a Southern legislator. And Washington is erupting with all kinds of partisan infighting. They were actually engaged in fisticuffs on the floor of the House of Representatives at that time period. So he's invited to leave the ministry of the Washington, D.C. church, and Alphonso Taft gets wind of the fact that he is available, and Alphonso Taft makes a trip to Washington, D.C., and invites him to become the minister of the First Congregational Church, of Cincinnati Unitarian, which is the original name of our church from 1830. That gets changed in the 1860s, I believe, to the First Unitarian Church. Maybe it's the 1870s. So anyway, he comes to Cincinnati in November of 1856, right after a pro-slavery president is elected, and his first sermon is about that election. But he does a lot of interesting things in Cincinnati, and keeping in mind he's only 24 years old, and he is greatly greatly impacted by all of the events that are going on inside Cincinnati, and he gets plugged into the arts and culture scene of Cincinnati. He ends up writing reviews in newspapers. He goes to the opera. He finds Cincinnati to be an absolutely charming place, and he loves it. And he does very little speaking about slavery because he knows that the congregation is nominally, at least, an abolitionist congregation, or at least anti-slavery. And so most of the things that he starts talking about are cultural issues. And this is when he gets himself into trouble because he's starting to evolve in his faith, and he is talking about issues like the divinity of Jesus. He's talking about the historical critical method of studying the Bible. And this rankles many of the members of the Washington or of the Cincinnati church who are more conservative, who still think of themselves as Unitarian Christians. And in fact, he is himself a Unitarian Christian, but he's starting to question all of that because of everything that he's reading. At this point in time, he's also discovering Charles Darwin, and he introduces Darwinian evolution to the congregation in the around 1857, 1858. He also invites Ralph Waldo Emerson to come to Cincinnati to speak, and it's one of the early visits that Emerson spends in Cincinnati, and he spends a week with Conway, and Emerson is also talking at the Mercantile Library at the same time. When Emerson gets into the sanctuary and preaches the Sunday morning service, he causes an outrage, and the conservative members of the congregation considered Emerson's presence in the pulpit as something that was defiling the pulpit. They used the term that they were nauseated by the appearance of Emerson behind their sacred pulpit. And so that gives you an idea of how divided this congregation, our congregation, is at that particular time on these theological issues of the divinity of Jesus, the nature of God, and where Christianity is going. And Conway finds himself on the left wing of that, but he has a serious right wing group of people to contend with. And in 1859, the right wing rebels against Conway, and 1/3 of the congregation elects to form a new congregation called the Church of the Redeemer, which still believes in the divinity of Jesus and all of the miracles and the supernatural state of the nature of God, something that people like Alphonso Taft and Judge Stallo and George Hoadley, who were all members, didn't believe in, and they stayed with Conway. But the problem there was it forced the congregation to sell the church because they had to split the assets of the congregation. And the Church of the Redeemer, even though they were only 1/3 of the congregation, they got half of the assets of the church. And they found another abandoned church to go to on 6th and Mound Street, which was an abandoned Universalist church. But when the building actually gets sold, First Unitarian Church then has no place to meet. And from 1862 or 1863, when the church is actually liquidated, till 1870, 7 years, First Unitarian Church goes without Conway and also without a place to meet. So they're renting assembly halls and opera houses to have their meetings on every Sunday basis. So this is a tough time for our church, and they suffer greatly from that. In 1862, in the summer, he gets wind that the Civil War has reached his family's farm in Northern Virginia, and the people that his family had enslaved are have liberated themselves, and they're roaming through the countryside of Virginia trying to get onto the northern side of the Civil War so that they can completely emancipate themselves. Conway immediately leaves his ministry in the summer. The church is closed in the summertime anyway. Our church stayed closed for 2 months every summer. And so he took that summer and he went to Washington, D.C., ended up meeting with Washington and meeting with Lincoln and other officials, and gets permission to find the people his family had enslaved. They finally reunite. They get some phony transportation papers from Lincoln, and they get on a train and come to Cincinnati, and he brings 30 people with him who were formerly enslaved, and he relocates them to Yellow Springs, where Antioch College is. And they stay there from that point forward. And it's one of the reasons that Yellow Springs is a racially integrated community. That ends his tenure in Cincinnati. He's ready to get onto a larger scene. The Civil War is in full bloom at this point, and so he moves to Concord to edit the Commonweal, which is an abolitionist newspaper, and that reunites him with Emerson and Hawthorne and Thoreau and other folks that he dearly loved. He only stays there a year because he becomes an emissary for the abolitionist movement to lobby the British government to stay out of the Civil War in 1863. So in 1863, he does that. And then within a year of moving into London, he becomes the minister of the South Place Chapel, which is a Universalist church in London. And it was a church that was founded by Elhanan Winchester, who was considered to be the founder of Universalism in America. And so he takes on the ministry of the South Place Chapel, and he quickly turns this Universalist church into more of a humanist church that embraces all kinds of religious backgrounds. If this is the place where the movement of Theosophy, which is the merger of Eastern thought and Western thought, gets founded, and Annie Besant, who becomes the leader of the leader of the Theosophy movement, actually lives with Moncure Conway and his wife, because Ellen and Annie Besant are best friends. And so throughout this period of time, Conway does many, many different things. He becomes a war correspondent as well as a minister. He becomes a public intellectual. He writes a series of books, one of them being this book on Christianity. He is traveling around and making many trips back and forth across the Atlantic. This is when he develops his deep friendship with Mark Twain, and he becomes Mark Twain's literary agent. And he also becomes a literary agent for Bronson Alcott and Louisa May Alcott, getting their books published in Europe, as well as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who he develops a very close friendship with. So in 1886, he comes back to New York. He retires from his ministry at the South Place Chapel, and writes several books in this time period, and one of them being the first biography of Emerson, another one a biography of Hawthorne. He also ends up writing the biography of Thomas Carlyle. And then the most important work that he does is he edits all of the papers of the Revolutionary War leader Tom Paine, and writes the first definitive biography of Thomas Paine, which is a 2-volume work and is still considered today to be the most authoritative and best biography of Tom Paine. Thomas Paine was the one who wrote the pamphlet Common Sense and was with George Washington at Valley Forge. In 1893, after he finishes the Thomas Paine books, he returns to London and the South Place Chapel, and he stays there until 1897. And then in 1897, his wife contracts terminal cancer, and she does not want to die in England. She wants to die in the United States, and so he moves back to New York so that she can die with her children nearby. And that's a pivotal point in his life. It's devastating for him because Ellen Conway was probably his major support, and she was his feminist conscience. She helped promote a lot of the things that he was engaged in, and he relied on her a lot for everything that he did. So he was pretty lost at this point. But things turn very rapidly in 1898 with the beginning of the Spanish-American War, and he and Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie start an anti-imperialist society in opposition to the Spanish-American War because all three of them decide that they do not want to see the United States become an imperial power. They think that that will be devastating for the moral character of our country, and they're devastated by the fact that the United States decides to become an empire. And it's kind of interesting in all of this because here's a man who had been hanging out with a lot of radicals in London. He was a good friend of Karl Marx's. He was a good friend of Charles Darwin, Charles Dickens, John Stuart Mill, and then he also becomes a very close friend of Andrew Carnegie's. I don't think there's anybody that I've ever known in world history that could claim friendship with Karl Marx and Andrew Carnegie in the same lifetime. So he's pretty remarkable in the fact that he did that. He works extensively with, after he leaves New York, he decides he's going to go to Paris, and that's where he spends the rest of his life. And from Paris, he gets involved in many issues related to international peace. And he works with Andrew Carnegie in drawing up plans for international peace organizations. And the work that they did becomes the blueprint for the League of Nations that's developed in 1929 and also is a foreshadowing the development of the United Nations. So in many ways, part of the legacy of Moncure Conway is the United Nations because he worked so hard on international peace. He also helped Carnegie develop the Carnegie Center for International Peace, which is still a foundation that exists in Washington, D.C. today. And as I said before, once he got to Paris, he became recognized as sort of like the elder statesman of the intelligentsia. He makes two trips in the early 1900s to Cincinnati. One in 1901, he comes and he delivers his very last sermon in our church sanctuary. There, that was when we were identified as part of Walnut Hills and not Avondale. He delivered a sermon there on a Sunday, and I think it was in April of 1901. And then in 1907, just a few months before he dies in Paris, he comes back to Cincinnati in the spring of 1907 to receive recognition from our congregation for his life's activities. So he keeps this constant contact with our congregation and with this city, which is really quite interesting. He served as a war correspondent in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War, and he embeds himself in the Prussian army and gives war dispatches back to the United States to let everybody in the United States know what's going on. And he sends those dispatches to the Cincinnati commercial newspaper, and they syndicate them around the country. So it's just a very, very unique life that you wouldn't find replicated by very many people. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of his theological thinking, because he starts out as a Methodist, and he's which is fairly conservative coming in the South. You know, most of the Southern aristocracy were Episcopalians, so his family was a bit different in being Methodist, and then his going to a Methodist school, Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But what do we know about Methodism? I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so we can actually see each other, and we'll come back to this slide. But let's talk a little bit about what it means to be an Orthodox Christian. So, any thoughts on what you would think Methodism means and what it means to be an Orthodox Christian in the middle of the 19th century?
Well, I had to look this up, Tim. Do you want me to
Sure, go
share what
ahead.
I Googled? um, Methodism is a Protestant Christian tradition that began as an 18th century revival movement within the Church of England, founded by John Wesley. Its core tenets include the belief that salvation is available to all, the importance of both personal faith and good works, and the concept of social holiness, which connects personal faith to social justice and service. Methodists are often described as emphasizing a methodical approach to living out their Christian faith through prayer, worship, study, and acts of compassion.
Okay, so Conway is introduced to a version of that is a colored by the American experience. And notice that what Patty read there was that salvation is available to all. Sounds an awful lot like universalism. And there was that element in John Wesley's theology. And so Conway gets introduced to a notion of universalism, at least a bit, but the Methodism that ends up coming to the United States gets, shall I say, corrupted. It gets corrupted by Calvinism. And what do we think are the prime elements of Calvinism that would be very different from what Patty just read about Methodism?
Predestination.
Yep, predestination. Anything else that comes to mind with Calvinism? There's this.
Salvation by faith alone.
It's not even salvation by faith, but salvation by the grace of God, that we cannot earn our salvation.
Ah.
And it's an interesting thing, because it's saying Calvin says that humanity is so depraved and so debased that none of us are worthy of paradise, or to be involved, be anywhere close to the presence of God. And it's only through God's grace that we get saved. That has to do with our faith, and that we are drawing on what Paul said about faith in the New Testament. But Paul said it's faith and grace together. That we have faith that we will be saved, but we don't know that. And that's where Calvin picks this up and says that nobody deserves it. And in fact, God has already predetermined who's going to go to heaven and who's going to go to hell, which is a pretty fatalistic approach to having a practice of faith, because if it's already determined, there's nothing you can do to gain God's favor and God's presence upon your death. And so that filters into American religion through the Pilgrims, and it comes over into Presbyterianism, and it's a big thing that actually infects Methodism, because Calvinism becomes the standard way of approaching Christianity. But in many ways, people came came to the United States from Europe. At least white people came from Europe to the United States to escape that heavy oppression of Calvinist predestinationism and the notion that we were no better than a worm on the ground, that we were that depraved. So he gets that kind of training when he's at Dickinson College, and he's starting to preach that when he's going around to all of these different churches on his circuit after he leaves Dickinson in those couple of years that he is a circuit rider. But he gets that tempered because he stays with Quakers. And the Quakers of Eastern Pennsylvania and Northern Maryland befriend him, and they introduce him to this notion of the personal side of what it means to be in the presence of God or the light of God. And so that has an impact on his thinking as well. He doesn't quite buy everything that the Quakers say, but he's intrigued by them, and he's also intrigued by their hospitality because they're helping to put him up when he's traveling around. And then he runs into William Henry Furness, who's the minister of the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. That was the church that Reverend Connie was a member of when she first found Unitarian Universalism. So he gets changed by all of this, and he stays a Christian, but he becomes a Unitarian Christian with a tinge of universalism in him, because he does have this John Wesley notion that it is possible that everybody can be saved. And so he becomes a Unitarian Christian. And that's when he meets Ralph Waldo Emerson. And what do we know about what Emerson had to say? And the fundamental precepts of transcendentalism. You want to quickly look up a definition of transcendentalism, Patty? But he goes to Boston after having this experience, and he's sort of dissatisfied with the circuit riding work. He's dissatisfied with the Methodist Church. He's intrigued by the Unitarians, and Furness has really convinced him of things. And he starts thinking differently. So what does transcendentalism say?
It is a 19th century philosophical, spiritual, and literary movement that emphasizes the innate goodness of people and nature, the importance of individual intuition over logic and experience, and the belief that true knowledge can be gained through personal experience and self-reliance. Originating in New England, it promoted spiritual and intellectual self-sufficiency as a way to overcome the corruption of society and institutions.
Okay, that's a mouthful. There's a lot there. And with transcendentalism, Conway sees it as a little mystical for him at this point. He sees it as a transcendentalism as this very personalized, individualistic journey. And he's not quite at that point in his life where he thinks that the religious experience is going to be this individual journey, because he, at this point, is becoming more and more of an anti-slavery identification, much more so than Emerson. Emerson considered himself anti-slavery, but he never was an activist. Emerson was a thinker, and he was a contemplative, and he never got engaged in all of this. And Conway, because of his upbringing, partly because he came out of this Methodist background, he's an activist. He wants to see social change. And that was one of the things that John Wesley did. He was a social change agent. in England. And so he still carries some of this Methodist idea that you're engaged deeply in the world and you're working for change. But he runs into people like Theodore Parker. And Theodore Parker um, is an amazing orator, and he is an amazing activist. And Conway gets engaged with Parker in trying to protect a formerly enslaved person who was seeking his freedom in Boston. And it turns out that this person Conway knew because he came from a plantation near where Conway grew up. And he actually knew this man when he was enslaved. And so it became personal for Conway. And he tried to protect this guy from being taken by the Fugitive Slave Act and the bounty hunters that were looking for him. There were pitched battles in Boston over the return of this man. And what happened as a result of this is it was a turning point in Conway's life because people back home in Northern Virginia began to get accounts of Conway fighting to keep this formerly enslaved man free when the owners of that guy wanted him back on the plantation in Northern Virginia. And so he was persona non grata in Northern Virginia. He went back for a visit to visit his family, and he was almost tarred and feathered in his early 20s because of this. So it's a major turning point, and it changes him and makes him a much more militant kind of abolitionist than Emerson ever could have been, because Emerson didn't engage in those kinds of campaigns. Emerson was writing and thinking more than doing. But at any rate, he comes then into Unitarianism as still a confirmed Christian. And he even brings that Christianity with him to Cincinnati. So we know a little bit more about Unitarianism, as you use. What would it mean to be a Unitarian Christian, you think, in the middle of the 19th century? What's distinguishing Unitarians from the rest of organized Christian churches?
Not believing in the Trinity, right?
That's the first thing, not believing in the Trinity. And then it also means that you are taking a very, very serious look at the written word, the scripture. And Orthodox Christianity has actually invented the concept of the Trinity. The Trinity does not exist in the Bible. It's not found in the New Testament. It's definitely not found in the Old Testament. The Trinity is a doctrine that's created in 326 AD, or Common Era, by the Council of Nicaea. So it's a 3rd century or 4th century invention or innovation of Christianity to differentiate it from other faiths. And so to be a Unitarian Christian means that you're taking the Bible more seriously and you're studying it as an academic work and trying to read the scriptures in their own with their own meaning, not trying to put dogma or doctrine on top of that meaning. And so that's very different than Orthodox Christianity, because Orthodox Christianity comes to the Bible and they try to overlay the dogma that's created by the Council of Nicaea and lay it over top the scriptures, and they bend and distort the scriptures and pick and choose sections of the scriptures to try to reaffirm their understanding of what they believe. These are things like the virgin birth, the crucifixion and the resurrection, all of these things that are part of the Nicene Creed that many of the mainstream Christian churches would teach their followers if they were going to become part of that faith. Well, the Nicene Creed is never repeated in a Unitarian church. and the Nicene Creed, the Unitarians see themselves as part of the Anabaptist movement in that regard, where they reject creeds and they want to read the Bible on its own terms. The other thing that's happening to Conway at this point is he's influenced by a man by the name of David Friedrich Strauss. And Strauss is a theologian in Germany who writes a book called Leben Jesu, or The Life of Jesus. And he is the first scholar to try to discover who the historical Jesus was. And he's trying to differentiate that between the mythological Jesus. And he writes a book that, based on his understanding in the mid-19th century, of applying the scientific methodology to the study of the Bible. And that becomes part of the rage of the Harvard divinity students who are Unitarian, is to try to apply the study of the Bible and the study of Christianity based on using the scientific method to find out what is myth and what is fact, and saying that myth is not necessarily bad. Myth is an allegory to illuminate truth, not to be the absolute truth, which is heresy in the minds of most Orthodox, well, all Orthodox Christians. So here we have Unitarianism staking out a claim as far back as William Ellery Channing, to say that we don't believe that the miracles are necessarily true. We do not believe in the divinity of Jesus. We believe that God is one and that Jesus is someone who is possibly divinely inspired by God and is very close to God, and maybe closer to God than any other human that ever existed, but is not God. And that's a huge difference. Now, when we get to Cincinnati, the problem for Unitarians is that most Unitarians are pretty wealthy, and this is the case of the church in Cincinnati. When Conway arrives in Cincinnati, he's told by some of the sharper members of our congregation that our congregation is worth tens of millions of dollars. And this is 19th century dollars. We're talking about the major industrialists of the city are members of our congregation. They're doing business, and some of them are doing business with the slavocracy of the South and making a lot of money in the process. But some are produce dealers, some are industrialists who work in textiles, some are making the machinery of the Industrial Revolution, building the steamboats. But because they're so well established in Cincinnati, they have a lot at stake business-wise to remain respectable in the eyes of the rest of Christian Cincinnati. And the hardcore Presbyterians and the Episcopalians are always looking askance at the Unitarians because they tend to be on the periphery or the edge of what is acceptable and still be called a Christian. And that's really kind of critical, and it plays a role in the split of our church, because I'll just use one example. Robert Hosea, who was the mayor of Clifton, and Hosea Avenue, where Dewey's Pizza is named after Robert Hosea. Robert Hosea was one of the board members in our congregation in the 1850s. And he was the head of the Chamber of Commerce. He was a grocer and a produce dealer, and he had organized all of the grocery businesses in Cincinnati and was quite wealthy in the process of doing that. He didn't want to lose business or respectability in the eyes of the Orthodox Christians of Cincinnati by having a minister who was going to be preaching from the pulpit things like, well, I'm not sure that Jesus was divine, and I don't believe in the miracles of Jesus. and that God is one, not three. They were having a hard enough time just supporting the notion that they believed that God was one and not three, because it was putting them on at odds with their business collaborators who were not Unitarians. So this is a big deal going on. And so when he starts doing that, and then when he brings Emerson into the congregation, and Emerson has this mystical, transcendental view of the relationship of humanity to God and nature, and Emerson has even written a book in the 1830s called Nature, where he is actually abandoning theology in favor of a form of evolution, which is very much mimicking what Charles Darwin writes about 15 years later. So Emerson is thinking about the issues of evolution before Darwin even publishes. And so Emerson comes on the scene and preaches from the church, and it gives these people heartburn because they know it could affect their bottom line. And it's an amazing dynamic that it takes place, because then there are other people in the church like Alfonso Taft who don't have to make a living by being businessmen and dealing with the public. They're lawyers representing they're lawyers and judges. Taft ultimately becomes a judge. So he doesn't have to be tied to the mercantile interests of the rest of the congregation. And so he can be a little more radical in all of this. But anyway, I want to pull up, I'm going to share again, and we're going to look at a couple of slides here. Let's see. You've seen that slide, and we'll get to the humanism part next. But this comes from Conway's autobiography, and it sort of reflects the impact that Emerson had on him. And Emerson often called his wife Queenie, which was his term of affection for her. And she said on one occasion she was speaking about the need for belief in something supernatural. And Emerson said gently, "Isn't it enough, Queenie, to look into the eyes of your child to find the supernatural?" And in a lot of ways, that captures what Emerson is talking about. And you can imagine how heretical that would be to an Orthodox Christian. The next slide, there's a book that Conway he publishes in 1858, which is a book of sermons that he delivered to First Unitarian Church. And they're quite interesting. And this is an excerpt from a sermon called Skepticism. So I'll just read it. It says, "Yet Hume may doubt the object to be certain of nothing, the highest condition of the mind. But the Christian skeptic only accepts doubt as the means whereby he is ever climbing from doubt to greater and more beautiful certainty. When will the world learn that it is only strong faith which can make skeptics? When men doubt and suffer and die for their doubt, as they have done over and over again, surely this would seem to require faith. There is more faith even in religious error than in the truest of inherited creeds. For none are so little in peril of thinking erroneously as those who never think at all. And no one will ever be a religious skeptic who has not enough faith and interest in the subject to search into it. After all, skepticism is only the garment of faith. The great skeptic is always the great believer." Now, he's writing this at the age of 26. That's pretty amazing for someone who's 26 years old to write like this, and to have been so well versed in philosophies. He's quoting Hume. He's a voracious reader. But he's introducing to the Cincinnati congregation the notion that we all must be skeptics. And there is a real interesting theological book that's just called Doubt, and one of the takeaways from that is the greater the doubt, the greater the faith. And it's a paradox. And what Conway's getting at is that skepticism is the doorway, or doubt is the doorway to deepening our faith, because we're held in this tension of paradox, of opposing views, and we have to come to some conclusion, because you can't live in that paradox without having the need to resolve it in some fashion. This is one of the tools of the greatest of teachers. The greatest teachers are the ones that can take students into a paradoxical situation and force the students to wrestle with the conflicting ideas to come to their own understanding of what it's all about. And here, Conway is trying to be a teacher. He's trying to actually show his congregation that they're in good company if they approach everything that is religious with a great deal of skepticism. Now, at the same time that this was going on, there was a group of people that met in Cincinnati just a door or two away from our church, which was on 4th Street. Oddly enough, our church was right beside the Second Presbyterian Church, which was the church that Harriet Beecher Stowe's father preached at, Lyman Beecher. And Lyman Beecher hated Unitarians. And the funny thing about it is that Lyman Beecher's brother-in-law was one of the founders of our congregation. His name was Samuel Foote, and he was Harriet's favorite uncle. And in fact, Lyman Beecher had to live with Samuel Foote for a solid year before the house that they were going to live in Walnut Hills, that exists still today, was built. So for the first year that they were in Cincinnati in 1832, Lyman Beecher and Harriet and the whole family were living with Samuel Foote. And Samuel Foote was going to the first Congregational Church Unitarian just beside Lyman Beecher's church. And Beecher saw Unitarianism as a corrosive force in American society because it reflected Enlightenment ideas, and he detested Thomas Jefferson. He detested John Adams and John Quincy Adams. The whole lot of the early founders of the American Republic he thought were heretics that were beyond salvation. So when he had to live with Samuel Foote, who was a founding member of our congregation, it was a tough deal for him to put up with living with a heretic. So anyway, this gives you an idea of the kind of conversations and tensions that existed in Cincinnati among the religious leadership. Now, let's go back, if I can here. It's 8:02, and I want to make sure that we don't go beyond our time limit. But what Conway is doing is he's moving this congregation, and he's moving himself at the same time, unknowingly, toward embracing Unitarian humanism. Now, there were a group of people, I started to say this story too, there were a group of people who met next door to the church on 4th Street, and they called themselves the Infidels. And they were skeptics of the highest order. They considered themselves atheists. They were rejecting all forms of organized religion. And Conway found himself attending their meetings and sitting in the corner and just listening to them debate. They met on Sunday afternoons after church, so Conway would leave the church and go next door to where the heretics were meeting, where the infidels were meeting, and listen to them expound upon their atheism and also extol the virtues of the revolutionary leader, Thomas Paine. He was the hero of these folks. And Thomas Paine was considered beyond the pale for most Americans, and he was considered, even though George Washington and Jefferson and Madison and Monroe all adored Thomas Paine because he reflected what they thought was the best of Enlightenment thought. The rest of America rejected Thomas Paine because of his atheism, and it's interesting, the relationship between Paine and George Washington was pretty important, and probably contributed to the fact that when Washington was president of the United States, he refused to take communion at the Episcopal Church, even though he was a member of the Episcopal Church. And he did this because he said, I'm the president of the entire United States. I'm not the president of the Christian United States. And because of the influence of people like Paine, George Washington kept relationships with the Jewish community and with the Muslim community in Washington, D.C. And in fact, many of the people that George Washington had enslaved were Muslim. And many of the people who were enslaved in Northern Virginia were Muslim. And so there were mosques, and he kept a relationship with them when he was president of the United States. So these folks were celebrating Tom Paine, and Conway listened to them, and he finally decided in 1860, for Tom Paine's birthday in January of 1860, that he would deliver a sermon on Thomas Paine. And if anybody wants to read that sermon, I do have a copy of it. The church it was met with such a resounding success in 1860, partly because the Church of the Redeemer folks, the conservatives, have already left the congregation, but it was accepted with such a resounding response that the church published the sermon and distributed it all over the city to talk about how wonderful Thomas Paine was. And because of that sermon, all the members of the infidels started attending First Unitarian Church. And so we became known as a Christian and a humanist church of believers and non-believers. And this started a dialogue inside our congregation of humanists and Unitarian Christians that still exists today. And so it has its origins. We had when Lois and I first started coming to First Church, there was a humanist group. They spelled it HUUMANIST, the First Church Humanists. And they met upstairs, and Dick Bozian was one of the founders of it, and several of the men and some of the women in our congregation would go to these humanist meetings after church. And in many ways, they were replicating the meetings of the infidels back in the 1850s. So what happens when you introduce humanism to this universalist or Unitarian Christianity? What's it going to do to us? What's it going to do to Conway? What do you think?
Well, I can't speak to what Conway thought, but to me, there's a missing piece, or there's an assumption that either you have to accept all the traditional tenets of the Christian faith, or you have to be an atheist. And this is absolutely not true. I mean, any progressive Christian today in any mainline denomination is at least in my experience, essentially Unitarian, except they may um, believe in the divinity of Christ, or at least that absolutely is not true of all progressive Christians, but at least believes perhaps that there is some sort of God or universal life force, or something like that. Um, I mean, Jesus never made up Christianity. I mean, we can attribute a lot of that to Paul. So, Jesus didn't talk about the virgin birth. Jesus didn't talk about, who knows what Jesus talked about, because, if you study anything about how the Bible was written and by whom and when, you know that a lot of the things that supposedly Jesus said, who knows? A lot of those people never met Jesus who were writing these things down. So, I mean, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but to me, it's not a clear cut. You either have to believe all these things or this. In fact, while you were talking, I just Googled, were Unitarians the only Christians who started to question whether they should take the Bible literally? And at least according to Google, the answer is no. Although they were a prominent group known for this position. Um, you know, some Christians belonging to or influenced by more traditional denominations began to adopt more liberal views on biblical literalism in response to new scientific and intellectual developments. I mean,
Yes.
I've run across a lot of Unitarians who think, they, for example, invented congregational church polity, or invented, liberal thinking, and that just isn't completely true.
Yeah. Well, this is what Conway was thinking. And here is a quote from his autobiography. And he gave the commencement address in 1886 at Harvard. And he is addressing the graduates of the Divinity School. And his theme, the new incarnation of religion, which I recognized in the humanitarian tendencies of all churches, which is exactly what you were saying, Patty. This is where he ends up in many ways. In 1864, he has a huge crisis of faith because his first son, who he named after Ralph Waldo Emerson, his first son was Emerson. Emerson dies from measles, and he's like 4 years old. He was born here in Cincinnati. Well, he was still in Cincinnati, and he was in England by that time, and he dies. And at that point, he questions the existence of God, and he goes through a terrific depression because of the loss of his son, and I think also because the son's name's Emerson, and there was a special bond that he had with this child because of his connection to Emerson, and so he grieves terrifically. And at this point, he declares himself an atheist, or at least an agnostic. And he wrestles with this for the rest of his life. And he loses another son then to typhoid fever, which again just takes all the moorings out from underneath him. And he has to come back to some sense of balance in life, and he works on it. And at this point in time, he's in London, and he's leading this church. Now, the church ultimately leaves all of its Christian origins. No, remember, it was originally a Universalist Christian church, and he ended up associating with the Unitarians in London as well. And he had people like Charles Dickens, who was a Unitarian, come to his church. And so he moves this congregation to what is known as an ethical society. And so they become not the South Place Universalist or South Place Chapel Universalist congregation. They are known as the South Place Ethical Society. And the South Place Ethical Society then becomes a meeting ground for all the humanists of London. Everybody who is interested in having these conversations about the intersection of religion and philosophy, they all start gathering at his congregation, and he gives sermons on this material from that point forward, all through the latter half of the 19th century. And it's a rich time for everybody that's engaged in this. And the kind of people that pass through his doors are really fascinating. Many of them are political radicals because London becomes the landing spot for almost every radical in the world who gets exiled from their own country. Karl Marx ends up living in London because he's exiled from the revolutions of 1848 out of Germany. Garibaldi and Mazzini, the founders of the modern Italian nation state, living in London, become very close friends with Conway, and they attend the Ethical Society and engage in debates there, and they use the place as fundraising. The refugees from the Paris Commune of 1871 end up in London because they're living in exile, and Conway ends up raising money with Marx for these folks. So there's this rich conversation that goes on. Now, the South Place Ethical Society ultimately becomes, after Conway's death, it is renamed Conway Hall, and it still exists today in another section of London, and it is considered the longest lasting ethical society in the world. And it's a cultural center of London where you can go and hear chamber music concerts, you can hear philosophical lectures, you can have your wedding there, you can see movies there. It's an amazing place, and it's a center of interesting cultural activity for the city of London. I've never been there, but I'm on their mailing list, and I get all of their information that they send out on a regular basis, and it's quite phenomenal, the different things that they engage in and the conversations and dialogues that take place there. But it certainly carries on the spirit of Conway. Now, one of the things that makes Conway different from the rest of Unitarianism and the Unitarian humanists is in 1877, he has a split with Unitarianism. And he and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Frederick Douglass, of all people, as well as a number of other religious leaders in America, formed the Free Religious Association. And Emerson gives the first two inaugural addresses of the Free Religious Association. And the Free Religious Association then is a thorn in the side of Unitarianism, because the American Unitarian Association will not allow anybody to become a member of the Unitarian Association unless they say that they believe in Jesus as the Son of God and call themselves a Christian. And it's for the same reasons that the conservative wing of the First Unitarian Church in Cincinnati had for not going along with Conway's humanism, because they were afraid of alienating the rest of organized Christianity and being ostracized socially and economically. And the AUA suffers from the same problem. It's not until the 20th century that the AUA accepts the idea that humanism is okay and you don't have to be a Christian to be a member of the AUA. Now, oddly enough, in 1875, 2 years before this split, the Church of the Redeemer and First Unitarian Church decide that they can no longer exist separate from each other. Like any divorce, they're suffering financially and they're struggling to maintain themselves. First Unitarian Church finally raises up enough money by 1870 to build a new church, and they build it directly across from City Hall, right beside Isaac Wise Temple or the Plum Street Temple, and diagonally across the street from the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. But City Hall is directly across the street. They build that church in 1870, and they have a man who followed Conway in the ministry. His name was Thomas Vickers. And Thomas Vickers, if anything, was even more militant than Conway was about these issues of humanism. And Thomas Vickers was probably a little clumsier in the way he went after things because he was very blunt about stuff. Conway went out of his way to build deep relationships with the Jewish community, with Archbishop Purcell, who was the head of the Catholic Church in Cincinnati. And Purcell and Conway actually engaged in a campaign to help prostitutes in Cincinnati. And Conway was campaigning for the legalization of prostitution so that they could be a protected class of people. And Purcell was right there with him to provide support for people who were engaged in the arts and couldn't make a living, or if they were engaged in prostitution. Thomas Vickers ends up attacking Purcell when in 1870 the St. John's Church, which becomes St. John's Unitarian, but it's a German Reformed church, when they build their church on Washington Park. The building still exists there beside Music Memorial Hall. Thomas Vickers is there, and he's the keynote speaker because we had a close relationship with St. John's at that time. He uses the opportunity to attack the Catholic Church and the Catholic Bible being used in public school instruction, which sets off a controversy in Cincinnati that is a separation of church and state controversy. Fortunately for all of us, Alfonso Taft was one of the three judges that had to hear the legal case that came as a result of this attack on the Catholic Church. And he wrote an opinion that was a minority opinion in this particular case. There were two other judges who were Orthodox Presbyterians who upheld the right of the Catholic of the Bible being taught in the schools. They just didn't want the Catholic Bible. They wanted the Protestant Bible in the church. And so they ended up ruling that the Catholic Bible is out, but the Protestant Bible is in. And Alfonso Taft wrote that this is a direct violation of the separation of church and state. And the case got appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court, and the Ohio Supreme Court ruled in favor of the minority opinion of Alfonso Taft, and they removed the Bible from public instruction in Cincinnati. And it became state law that the Bible could not be used as an instructional tool in the classrooms of any public school in Ohio. That was a direct result of this humanist influence on the First Unitarian Church. And so in 1875, after all of this had taken place, the two congregations realized that they're going to have to reunite if they're going to survive at all. And there were serious negotiations because some of the most strident leaders of the Church of the Redeemer, who still said they believed in the divinity of Jesus and the miracles, agreed to give up that doctrine of the divinity of Jesus and the belief in miracles in order to merge back with the church, with First Unitarian Church. And so First Unitarian Church officially becomes a Unitarian Christian humanist church in 1875. And they invite Moncure Conway to come back and deliver the reunification sermon in 1875. So he's living in London at the time, and he's in the United States on a speaking tour. And he shows up in Cincinnati and he gives a sermon titled First Love Again. And it's an amazing sermon. I think we should have it on our website. Actually, it's a beautiful sermon. But he he also at that point says that he could have done things differently in 1859 that maybe could have prevented the schism of the congregation, and he accepted responsibility for that and asked for forgiveness from people. But he was also elated that they had given up their superstitions, and he called it superstitious religion, in favor of a more Christian humanist approach to Christianity. And so that's sort of where he ends up. Now he goes back and forth all over the map throughout the rest of the 19th century on these issues of humanism and theism. He makes a trip around the world. He stops in India. He talks with people who are religious leaders in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and in Bombay and a few other places in India. He meets the Indian holy men, and he's greatly influenced by Hinduism. And one of the things that was a gift from Emerson was that the first summer that they lived together, Emerson opened his entire library to Conway, and he could read whatever he wanted. And Emerson had one of the largest collections of Eastern religion books in America at that time. And Conway just gorged himself on Eastern religion that summer before he entered Harvard and went to the divinity school. So he was greatly influenced by Hinduism, and then capped it off with this trip to India, and he also went to Australia for a speaking tour as well, and then stopped off in South Africa before coming back to London. But he had an amazing life and an amazing impact on our faith tradition and on our congregation. It's interesting when I've talked with the historians at Harvard today, who are the Unitarian Universalist historians, they barely recognize Moncure Conway as Unitarian. And they don't include any of his writings in the anthologies or collected anthologies of Unitarian and Universalist thinkers. He's still considered beyond the pale, and I think it was this 1877 split with Unitarianism that led to that he was just written off by the AUA and continues to be written off by the Unitarian Universalist Association, even though everything he was saying in 1880 and 1877 is exactly what Unitarian Universalists today are saying. So it's an amazing journey that he's made. Are there any questions or comments or?
Unhook me a second, John.
You on, John? Okay. Fritz, did you want to say something?
Well, maybe a little bit peripheral to your talk, but can you say something about the difference between 19th century Unitarianism and 19th century Universalism?
Yeah, that would be, the 19th century Universalists tended to be more radical. They were lower class people. They were backwoods people often, and they thrived on conflict. I've got this little tiny book in my library that Frank Carpenter gave me, and it's called To Preach and to Fight, A History of Universalism in Southern Ohio and Indiana.
Wow.
And they went around and they thrived on conflict. They would go from town to town and they would challenge the Calvinist preachers in every town, and they used the social media of the day. They would advertise their challenge to a debate ahead of time, 2 weeks ahead of time, saying, I'm coming to your town, I'm coming to Middletown, Ohio, and I'm challenging so and so who is the Calvinist preacher down the street to a debate about Jesus and Christianity. And they were very skilled debaters, and they usually would make mincemeat out of the Calvinist preachers because the Calvinist preachers were not that sophisticated and they were not that skilled in debate. And the Universalists would just clean the floor with them. And they would build a congregation with all the people that gathered for these camp meetings. There would be several days of debate that would take place. And then they'd move on to the next town, and then they would build their own circuit of churches that they serviced after they did these debates to keep these congregations alive. The Universalists were also rather mystical in their theology. They were the church, the Universalist church that's in Springboro, Ohio, it's an old building. It's run by a fundamentalist church today, but I got in the church because of Dan Boron, who's the city manager at Springboro, and they have all of these symbols in their stained glass windows that come out of Rosicrucianism and that come out of the Knights Templar movement. They even have a Knights Templar stained glass window. And if you know anything about the Knights Templar and the Rosicrucian movement, it's somewhat distantly related to the whole story that Dan Brown told in the Da Vinci Code, looking for the connection to Mary Magdalene and what is the Holy Grail. And the Universalists were involved in that kind of stuff. They called themselves philomaths, which means they were lovers of knowledge. And there was this one Universalist who set up a town in eastern Indiana, real close to where Brookville is today, and the town is called Philomath. And it's just a collection of buildings today. It's just like 5 houses. But it was a town called Philomath, and that was a Universalist community. But they also tended to be more militant abolitionists, and they were more actively engaged in the Underground Railroad than the Unitarians were. The Unitarians tended to have a lot more to risk in social prestige and economic clout, so they didn't actually engage that much in the Underground Railroad. Now, Linnea Lose did some study of some of the members of our congregation with Walter Hers, and found out that the Rawson family, where Rawson Estates is located in Clifton, you know, that big yellow house that's right beside the Clifton area neighborhood school. It was UC owned it, and Cincinnati Public recently bought it. That was the Rawson estate. The Rawsons, like the Hoseas, were members of our congregation. And the one Rawson wife would disappear, and it was assumed that she was actually doing work on the Underground Railroad, working with Levi Coffin and Catherine Coffin. She was one of the exceptions in our congregation that was doing that. But she was taking great risk because there was a lot of social prestige to be lost in a town that was decidedly pro-slavery. And the Cincinnati Enquirer wasted no opportunity to attack our church and to attack Conway and the infidels that attended our congregation and the heretics, because the Cincinnati Enquirer was a militantly pro-slavery newspaper, and it became the dominant paper in the latter part of the 19th century. So yeah, the Universalists, they grew rapidly. There were more than 60 Universalist churches in Ohio when there were only like 12 Unitarian churches in Ohio by 1860. And The problem with the Universalists is that they tended to be anarchists. They didn't what they had in fervor and excitement about their ministry, they lacked in organizational skills. And what the Unitarians lacked in fervor, they had in spades in organizational skills. And that's why the Unitarians outlasted them, because the Unitarians were institutionalists and the Universalists were iconoclasts. They would rather let a ministry fold than compromise their values. And when a circuit rider got done, there was nobody to replace him, and so those churches would sort of wither without a circuit riding minister coming by to revive them every so often. And it took a special kind of character to be a Universalist minister, because you had to want to be combative, because you were introducing heresy to rural communities. But yeah, there's a lot more to be written about Universalists. I think I think they're really fascinating people, and this connection to Rosicrucianism and the Knights Templar and all of the mysticism that there were even Masonic symbols in the stained glass windows at this church. So they saw. They celebrated Stephen D. Millay, who was the young D. Millay is the young person's version of the Order of Masons, and he was a martyr to the Knights Templar. It was killed in France. But anyway, there's a lot there to unpack. It's 8:35, so thanks for hanging in.
This
Thank
was
you, Tim.
fascinating, Tim. Thank you very much.
Let's see now if I can figure out how to stop this.
Well, I can do it if you want.
I'm trying to figure out how to stop recording.
Oh,
We can
Well-
just leave meeting up at the top if you
Oh,
want.
up at the top, there it is.
yeah.
There we go.